Professor Zeitrel stood in the center of the vast lecture hall, his elongated fingers resting on the sleek control panel embedded into his podium. His pale blue skin shimmered slightly under the dim artificial lighting, the glow of holographic projections casting shifting colors across his sharp features. Behind him, an enormous circular screen displayed the topic of today's challenge, predicting future outcomes with probability matrices and temporal modeling. Seated in precise, curved rows were students from various planets, each representing the intellectual elite of their respective species. Their expressions ranged from eager anticipation to quiet arrogance, especially from those belonging to the advanced civilizations whose predictive technologies had outpaced many others in the known galaxy. Among the students sat Danny Green, the only human enrolled in the Galactic Academy's prestigious Strategic Intelligence course. He had learned early on that his presence in this class was met with skepticism, if not outright dismissal, from most of his peers. Professor Zeitrel's three iridescent eyes swept over the assembled students before he spoke, his voice smooth yet commanding. Today's challenge is not for the faint of mind. You will be presented with a dynamic scenario, one where variables shift and unforeseen elements arise. Your objective is to predict the most probable outcome before the events conclude. The accuracy of your predictions will determine your success. A low murmur of excitement spread through the hall as students exchanged glances. Some of them immediately activated their neural interfaces, connecting their minds to the Academy's computational network. Danny, however, remained still, his fingers idly drumming against the desk's surface as he observed the professor. Zeitrel continued, gesturing toward the screen. The simulation will present a hypothetical crisis. Each of you will receive access to the same set of initial data. You are free to use any mathematical models, probability matrices, or strategic forecasting methods at your disposal. Those who fail to reach a sufficiently accurate prediction will receive a failing grade. At this, several students straightened in their seats, their postures sharpening with determination. For them, this was a routine test, another opportunity to demonstrate their superiority in logical computation. Danny exhaled slowly and leaned back in his seat. He had already anticipated something like this. In every class, the emphasis was always on raw data processing, statistical algorithms, and complex simulations. The aliens viewed intelligence as a matter of computing power and precision. They believed that the best strategist was the one who could process the highest number of possibilities in the shortest amount of time. Danny had a different perspective. The room dimmed as the holographic projection expanded, forming a three-dimensional battlefield in the center of the lecture hall. Ethereal soldiers materialized, their figures flickering between translucent blue and red, representing opposing factions. The scenario was set on a barren, cratered landscape, an uninhabited moon that held vital resources. Two rival nations had dispatched their forces to claim control, and the students were expected to predict how the battle would unfold based on troop movements, available resources, and command decisions. You have precisely 6 hours, Zeitrel announced, clasping his hands behind his back. Begin. At once, the hall erupted into action. Students projected holographic interfaces above their desks, streams of data cascading in midair. Some preferred traditional numerical tables, others relied on intricate multidimensional graphs, while the most advanced among them constructed real-time neural simulations, linking their minds to the Academy's AI for faster processing. The room was filled with the quiet hum of computation, layered with the occasional whisper as students exchanged theories. Danny did none of this. Instead, he reached into his bag and pulled out a small, worn wooden box. A soft click echoed as he opened it, revealing a classic chess set inside. The finely crafted pieces were slightly faded from years of use. With practiced ease, he set up the board on his desk, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he had all the time in the world. From across the room, a scoff sounded. Zal, a Xenarian student with sleek silver skin and 4 keen eyes, tilted his head in amusement. "What are you doing, human?" he asked, his voice carrying a tone of thinly veiled mockery. "Did you not hear the professor? This is a complex prediction challenge, not some archaic board game." Danny didn't look up as he positioned the last piece. "I heard him," he replied evenly. Zal let out a huff, his expression condescending. "Then why waste time? You're already at a disadvantage with your species' primitive computational abilities. Or do you truly believe that some old Earth game will help you see the future?" Danny finally met Yazal's gaze, his green eyes calm but unwavering. "Chess isn't about seeing the future," he said, tapping his knight thoughtfully. "It's about understanding patterns before they form." Zanarian sneered but said nothing more, turning his attention back to his own interface, where thousands of variables were running through a high-speed processor. He was one of the brightest students in the class, and he fully expected to outperform a human. Danny, meanwhile, played his game alone. He moved the pieces slowly at first, then more quickly as his mind mapped out different sequences. Every decision made by the simulated armies reminded him of past matches, of famous strategies played by grandmasters centuries ago. The battle unfolding before them was no different from a carefully orchestrated game, both sides maneuvering for control, waiting for the right moment to strike. As he worked through possible outcomes, he remained detached from the chaos around him. While his classmates relied on raw computational speed, he trusted instinct, intuition, and an understanding of human nature that no algorithm could replicate. Hours passed. Professor Zeitrel observed quietly, his three eyes flicking toward Danny's desk more than once. He had anticipated that the human would struggle, would flounder against the overwhelming superiority of his alien peers. And yet, there was something undeniably methodical about his approach. He was not guessing. He was not hesitating. He was playing, and in playing he was predicting. The 6-hour mark approached, and the atmosphere in the room grew heavier. Students finalized their calculations, submitting detailed projections filled with probability charts and statistical models. Yazal leaned back in his chair with a confident smirk, certain of his accuracy. Danny made one last move on his board, then sat back, exhaling through his nose. He closed the chess set with a soft click and folded his arms. His prediction was complete. Professor Zeitrel stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "Time is up," he announced. "Let us see who among you was correct." A hush fell over the room as the true sequence of events played out on the holographic display. The battle reached its final stage, and the outcome was revealed. At that moment, the hall was no longer filled with quiet confidence. It was filled with shock, because the only student who had predicted the exact result, down to the smallest detail, was Danny Green. Professor Zeitrel stood motionless for a moment, his three iridescent eyes scanning the data in front of him. The numbers, the probabilities, the complex matrices formed by his students, none of them aligned as perfectly with reality as Danny Green's simple chessboard predictions. He did not speak immediately, nor did he acknowledge the murmurs spreading through the lecture hall like ripples in still water. The shock was palpable. Danny sat with his arms folded, his expression unreadable. His classmates exchanged confused and frustrated glances, unable to comprehend how a primitive strategy game could outperform their most sophisticated predictive models. The weight of the revelation pressed down on them, but none more so than Yazal, who had spent hours refining his calculations, only to see them crumble in an instant. Zal's hands clenched into tight fists. His silver skin shimmered under the glow of the holographic interface still hovering before him, its intricate web of projections now little more than a monument to his failure. His jaw tensed as he turned toward Danny, his four sharp eyes narrowing with barely restrained frustration. "That's impossible," Yazal said, his voice cold but edged with disbelief. "There's no way a game, a relic of your primitive past, could predict a dynamic battlefield more accurately than a computational analysis." Danny didn't respond immediately. He let the words hang in the air, let the weight of his correct predictions settle on those who had so easily dismissed him before. Then he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and met Yazal's glare with a calm, unwavering gaze. "You made one mistake," Danny said, his voice even. "You trusted your numbers more than you trusted the nature of your opponents." Zal's expression darkened. "I accounted for every variable." Danny tilted his head slightly. "Did you? Or did you just account for the ones your system could calculate?" The murmurs in the room grew louder. Other students began pulling up their data again, rechecking their models, trying to find the flaw. But there was none. Their calculations had been mathematically sound, logically airtight, and yet the battle had played out differently. Danny had seen it coming when no one else had. Professor Zeitrel finally moved. He raised a hand, silencing the growing noise in the room. His gaze settled on Danny with something between curiosity and something far more dangerous. something resembling respect. "Explain your reasoning," Zytrell said. Danny glanced at the chessboard still sitting on his desk. He reached out, moved a single piece, a knight, 2 spaces forward, then tapped it lightly with his finger. "A battlefield isn't just numbers and probabilities," Danny said. "It's a game of strategy, of momentum, of psychology. You don't just calculate your opponent's best move, you anticipate the one they think is best. And that's something an algorithm will always struggle with." Xal's nostrils flared. "So you're saying you predicted the entire battle, every maneuver, every casualty, by using a game board designed for your own species?" Danny shook his head. "Not just the board, the patterns. Every commander makes decisions based on the same fundamental principles. It doesn't matter if they're human, Xenarian, or any other species. Greed, fear, overconfidence, they all follow predictable patterns. I just recognize them first." A different voice cut through the tension. "So, you're saying we failed because we relied on logic?" The speaker was Drill, a reptilian Thrinian with deep green scales and a ridged crest along his forehead. His narrow eyes flicked between Danny and the professor. Danny exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "I'm saying you failed because you relied only on logic." Professor Zytrell clasped his hands behind his back, his expression unreadable. "And yet logic is the foundation of all advanced civilization." Danny nodded. "It is. But logic isn't the same as intuition," Zazel scoffed. "Intuition is nothing more than unreliable guesswork," Danny smirked. "Then why was my guesswork more accurate than your equations?" Silence fell over the room once more. Professor Zytrell turned back to the large holographic display, where the battle's final moments replayed in slow motion. He studied it intently, analyzing the exact sequence of moves that had led to Danny's correct prediction. His fingers hovered over the control panel as he ran the events backward, tracing the pivotal decisions made by the simulated commanders. Then he spoke again. "Intuition is the ability to recognize patterns without conscious reasoning. It is not guesswork, it is an advanced form of pattern recognition." His words echoed through the hall, sending a ripple of discomfort through the students. None of them had ever heard Professor Zytrell acknowledge something beyond raw computation as a valid form of intelligence, and yet here he was, doing exactly that. Zal, however, was not ready to concede. "So what now? Are we supposed to ignore everything we've learned in favor of playing children's games?" Danny shrugged. "I never said that. You have tools I don't. I have tools you don't. The only difference is that I know when to use mine." Professor Zytrell studied Danny for a long moment before turning back to the class. "We will conduct a second exercise," he announced, ignoring the brief flicker of surprise that passed through the students. "This time, you will all integrate what you have learned today. You will still rely on data and computation, but you will also apply strategic intuition. Those who fail to adapt will fail the assignment." Zal bristled at the statement, his pride already wounded. But the professor's decree was final. Danny sat back in his chair, watching as the other students adjusted their strategies. Some of them seemed to be reevaluating their approach already. Others, like Yezal, refused to accept that anything had changed. But Danny knew the truth. The game had already started. The air in the lecture hall had grown tense, thick with an unspoken challenge that lingered between Danny and the rest of the class. Professor Zytrell's decision to conduct a second exercise was unexpected, but Danny knew exactly why it had been made. This wasn't just about correcting an oversight. This was a test. Not of numbers, not of calculations, but of adaptability. The professor wanted to see if his students were capable of evolving their strategies, of recognizing that logic alone was not enough to master the unpredictability of real-world conflicts. Danny watched as the holographic battlefield reset, its terrain shifting subtly as new parameters were introduced. The simulated war zone was no longer the same barren moon. Now it was a densely forested planet, thick with mist and uneven ground, a place where visibility was compromised and traditional tactics would struggle. This was deliberate. Zytrell was forcing his students out of their comfort zones, ensuring that their previous computations would be useless. Across the room, Yezal's silver fingers danced over his interface, recalibrating his models with renewed aggression. His pride had been wounded, but that only made him more dangerous. Danny had seen that kind of reaction before. A man desperate to prove himself could be more reckless than a man who had already lost. Yazal's overconfidence had been his greatest weakness in the first exercise, and Danny suspected it would be again. Citral raised a hand, signaling for silence. "This time, there will be a new element introduced into the battle," he said, his voice smooth and deliberate. "Each of you will be given access to classified intelligence regarding both factions. You will know their histories, their philosophies, their tendencies. Use this information wisely." A low hum spread through the room as new data appeared on each student's interface. Some leaned forward eagerly, diving into the profiles of the opposing commanders, studying their past battles, their strengths, their failures. Danny, however, remained still. He already knew what he was looking for. Patterns, not numbers, not probabilities, patterns of behavior, decision-making tendencies that would reveal themselves if he paid close enough attention. He scanned the provided intelligence, filtering through unnecessary details, focusing on what mattered. The general leading the Red Army was an Uldari veteran named Gorath Vex, notorious for his calculated ruthlessness. He was methodical, unemotional, and had never once deviated from the statistical optimal move in any recorded battle. The Blue Army, by contrast, was led by a younger, unpredictable commander named Selin Droth, who had a reputation for erratic but occasionally brilliant tactical maneuvers. That was all Danny needed to know. The students around him began their work in earnest, deploying algorithms to assess the likely movements of each force. This time, they weren't relying solely on cold probability, they were factoring in psychology, studying the tendencies of their simulated commanders. It was a step in the right direction, but Danny could already see the flaw. They were treating history as a fixed pattern rather than an evolving one. He leaned back in his chair, letting his thoughts settle, watching the battlefield unfold. Gorath Vex would do exactly what the numbers dictated. He would fortify his position, conserve his forces, and counter any reckless aggression with calculated precision. Selendroth, on the other hand, would be expected to behave unpredictably, to make a seemingly illogical move at some point, but therein lay the trap. If everyone expected him to be unpredictable, then his most unpredictable move would be to do exactly what was expected. Danny exhaled slowly, reaching for his chessboard again. He didn't need an interface to predict what was about to happen. He didn't need flashing lights and data projections. He moved a piece forward, letting his mind settle into the rhythm of the game. His fingers hovered over the pieces as he visualized the battlefield, placing each army in its correct position. He moved his queen aggressively, then he moved it back. Zell glanced at him from across the room, catching sight of the movement. His 4 eyes narrowed. "You're wasting time again," he said, his voice edged with irritation. Danny didn't look up. "I'm watching," Yazal scoffed. "Watching what? The outcome hasn't been decided yet." Danny smirked. "It has. You just haven't seen it." Professor Zytrel, who had been observing in silence, stepped forward. "Then tell me, Danny Green, what is the outcome?" The murmurs in the room quieted. Eyes turned toward him, some in curiosity, others in skepticism. Danny leaned forward, tapping a single chess piece. "Selendroth will feign retreat within the first 3 engagements. He'll make it look like desperation, like he's being overwhelmed. Gorath Vex, being as methodical as he is, will push forward cautiously, believing he's securing an easy victory. But he'll stop short of overextending. He won't overcommit. Not immediately." Professor Zytrel folded his arms. "Go on." Danny moved another piece. "The moment Gorath Vex fortifies his position, Droth will attack, but not with his main force. He'll send a smaller unit, a feint, something reckless enough to make Vex believe he's lured him into another mistake. Vex will counterstrike decisively, wiping out that unit." He placed another piece forward. "And that's when Droth's real forces, which have been waiting in the mist, will encircle him. He'll spring the trap." He'll let out a dry laugh. "You expect us to believe that you can predict all of this with certainty, without running a single calculation?" Danny met his gaze. "It's not certainty, it's inevitability." Silence. Professor Zytrel regarded him carefully before turning back to the battle simulation. "Let us see." The simulation unfolded, and just as Danny had predicted, the battle played out in exact detail. Selendroth feigned retreat. Gorath Vex advanced cautiously but did not overcommit. A reckless attack followed, one that Vex immediately punished. But the moment his forces moved forward in response, the true assault began. The mist concealed the ambush until it was too late, and in the final moments of the battle, Vex's forces were completely encircled. The simulation ended. A heavy silence filled the room. Professor Zeitrel turned to face Danny, his expression unreadable. "You did not guess." Danny shook his head. "No." The professor tilted his head slightly. "Then what did you do?" Danny exhaled. "I read the players, not the board." The weight of his words settled over the students, but no one spoke. Yazal's fists were clenched, his frustration barely restrained. Danny could see it in his posture and the way his breathing had tightened. Yazal wasn't just angry. He was beginning to understand. Professor Zeitrel studied Danny for a long moment before finally speaking. "The lesson is over. But for some of you, the learning has only begun." Professor Zeitrel remained motionless for a long moment after the simulation concluded. His 3 iridescent eyes shifted slightly, scanning the faces of his students, gauging their reactions. Some were still trying to process what had happened. Others, like Yazal, sat in stony silence, their minds wrestling with a truth they were unwilling to accept. Danny Green, however, remained composed, his expression unreadable. The weight of the moment hung over the lecture hall, thick and unyielding. No one had expected a human to outmaneuver them. Not twice, not with such precision, and yet here they were, staring at the holographic battlefield where Danny's prediction had played out exactly as he had described. The realization settled like a heavy stone in their chests. Zeitrel finally spoke. "Class dismissed." The words should have felt final, but they weren't. They were merely a formality, a way of signaling that the exercise was over. But no one moved, no one gathered their things. The weight of the moment lingered, pressing down on them all. Yazel's fingers twitched against the surface of his desk, his silver skin catching the light. His 4 sharp eyes remained locked on Danny, unreadable yet simmering with something unspoken. Danny sighed, closing his chest set with a soft click before slipping it back into his bag. He could feel the tension radiating from across the room, the unasked questions forming in the minds of those around him. They wanted to understand, to rationalize what had happened, but for some of them, understanding was secondary to something else, something more personal. Yazal's pride had been wounded, and that made him unpredictable. As Danny stood, Yazel finally spoke. "You think this means something?" Danny paused, tilting his head slightly. "What do you mean?" Yazal's silver fingers curled into a fist. "You think that just because you got lucky twice, you've proven something, that you're better than us." Danny exhaled through his nose, turning to fully face him. "It's not about being better," Yazal scoffed. "Then what is it about?" Danny met his gaze steadily. "It's about seeing the board differently." The words only seemed to deepen the tension. Around them, other students were watching now, some with open curiosity, others with guarded expressions. No one interrupted. No one attempted to diffuse the moment. Even Professor Zeitrel remained silent, observing. Zal pushed his chair back abruptly, rising to his full height. He was taller than Danny, his lean frame built for speed rather than strength, but the intensity in his stare made up for whatever physical difference existed between them. His lips curled slightly, a flicker of something dangerously close to amusement crossing his face. "You're confident," he said. Danny shrugged. "I've been told." Zal took a slow step forward, his movements controlled. "Then prove it." Danny raised an eyebrow. "Didn't I just do that?" Zal's smirk didn't falter. "You beat a simulation." "That's different." Danny glanced at the others, noting the way their eyes flickered between him and Yazal. There was something unspoken in the air now, a challenge not just between the two of them, but between 2 ways of thinking. Danny had forced them to reconsider their methods, and Yazal wasn't ready to accept that without pushing back. Professor Zeitrel finally spoke, his voice smooth but firm. "What do you propose?" Yazal didn't hesitate. "A real test," Danny sighed. "Of what, exactly?" Yazal tilted his head slightly, his silver eyes glinting. "Your strategy, your instincts. You predicted the battlefield twice, but can you handle something when it's real? When it's not a controlled simulation?" Danny exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. He wasn't surprised by this. He had known that Yazal wouldn't let things end here. The Zenarian was too proud, too determined to prove that Danny's success had been nothing more than luck. If Danny refused, it would only reinforce the idea that he had won by chance. If he accepted, it meant stepping into something he wasn't entirely sure he could control. He glanced at Zeitrel. "And you're allowing this?" The professor studied him for a moment before inclining his head slightly. Within reason, Danny considered for a beat longer, then nodded. "Fine, What's the challenge? Yazal's smirk widened just a fraction. A pursuit. The word hung in the air, vague yet charged with implication. Danny narrowed his eyes slightly. Pursuit? Yazal gestured toward the room's central control panel where the simulations were conducted. We set up a real scenario. One of us is the hunter, the other is the hunted. If your instincts are as sharp as you think, you should be able to evade me. Danny exhaled slowly. This was dangerous territory. It wasn't just another academic exercise. It was personal now. Yazal wanted to prove something, and he was willing to push the limits to do it. Danny could refuse, walk away, pretend it didn't matter, but he knew it would matter. To them, to the professor, to himself. He met Yazal's gaze and nodded once. All right, you're on. A murmur rippled through the class, excitement, uncertainty, anticipation. Professor Zytrel remained impassive, though his 3 eyes flickered with something unreadable. The conditions? Zytrel asked. Yazal's expression didn't change. A planetary simulation, no weapons, just strategy. Danny arched an eyebrow. And the objective? Yazal's smirk sharpened. Survival. Danny exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders as he considered. How long? Yazal's gaze was steady. 1 hour. If you evade me for 60 minutes, you win. If I catch you before then, I win. Danny held his stare for a moment longer, then nodded. Fine. Professor Zytrel pressed a button on his console, and the central screen flickered to life once more. The terrain shifted, morphing into something new. Dense jungle, high humidity, uneven ground. It was the perfect setting for a hunt. Zytrel turned back to them. The simulation begins in 5 minutes. Prepare yourselves. Danny inhaled deeply, his mind already shifting into the mindset of a hunted man. He wasn't worried about running. He wasn't even worried about Yazal's speed. What mattered now wasn't strength or endurance. It was strategy, and Danny Green never played a game he didn't intend to win. The countdown to the simulation had begun. Danny stood in front of the massive holographic interface, his mind already adjusting to the game he was about to play. This wasn't like the battle simulations before. It wasn't about predicting armies, commanders, or battlefield maneuvers. It was about him, his mind, his ability to stay ahead of an opponent who was faster, physically superior, and motivated by a need to prove himself. Zal stood across from him, his silver eyes locked onto Danny with a quiet intensity. There was no more smugness now, no more scoffing at human intuition. This was something different. This was personal. Professor Zytrel had already outlined the parameters. 60 minutes of pursuit, no weapons, no assistance. If Danny could avoid capture for the full duration, he would win. If Yazal caught him, the victory would be his. The environment flickered to life, and within seconds, Danny felt himself transported into the simulation. He was no longer in the lecture hall, he was standing in the middle of a dense jungle, the air thick with humidity, the scent of damp earth clinging to his skin. Tall, broad-leaved trees stretched high above, their twisted roots creating a treacherous terrain beneath his feet. In the distance, he could hear the faint sound of running water, a river, maybe. Somewhere behind him, Yazal would be dropped into the simulation as well, given only one instruction: hunt. Danny inhaled slowly, grounding himself. The clock had started. He moved immediately, not running but not walking either, keeping his steps light, his breathing steady. Running outright would be a mistake. It would create too much noise, disturb too much of the terrain. Yazal would pick up on those disturbances quickly. Instead, Danny moved like a shadow, choosing his steps carefully, ensuring that each footfall blended with the natural soundscape of the jungle. His mind worked in patterns. Yazal was fast. Faster than him. That meant outrunning him was impossible. Instead, he had to use the jungle itself, turn it into an advantage rather than an obstacle. He adjusted his trajectory, angling toward higher ground. If he could gain elevation, he could control the engagement, force Yazal into predictable paths. Minutes passed. Danny reached a ridge, its incline steep but manageable. He pulled himself up, using exposed roots as handholds. When he reached the top, he took a moment to scan the terrain below. The jungle stretched out in all directions, its dense canopy making it impossible to see too far ahead. That worked in his favor. If he couldn't see Yazal, then Yazal couldn't see him. Then the silence shifted. A branch cracked in the distance. Danny froze. He turned his head slightly, listening, waiting. Another sound, Light, almost imperceptible, but there. Yazal was close. He was moving carefully, methodically. He wasn't charging in blindly, he was hunting. That meant he wasn't relying solely on speed, he was thinking. Danny exhaled through his nose. Good. That makes this interesting. He moved again, shifting his direction, angling toward a cluster of thick tree roots that created a natural hollow. He dropped low, tucking himself into the space, allowing the shadows to swallow him. Yazal would be scanning for movement. If Danny remained perfectly still, he could force Yazal to second-guess his position. Seconds ticked by. Then minutes. Another sound. Closer this time. Danny's muscles tensed. But he didn't move. He controlled his breathing, keeping it shallow and steady. If Yazal got too close, Danny would have to make a choice. Stay hidden and risk being cornered, or move and reveal his position. A flicker of movement in the foliage. Danny watched as Yaxel stepped into view, just beyond the tree line. His silver skin gleamed faintly under the simulated light filtering through the canopy. His posture was controlled, his head tilting slightly as he listened to the jungle around him. Danny remained perfectly still, his heartbeat steady. Don't react. Don't engage. Let him make the first mistake. Yazal took another step, his eyes scanning the area, his fingers twitched slightly. A subtle movement, but one that told Danny everything he needed to know. Yazal wasn't entirely sure where he was. He was close, but not close enough. Danny made his move. Slowly, carefully, he shifted his weight, allowing gravity to pull him further into the hollow. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to keep him hidden. He waited. He could feel the seconds stretching, the tension thick between them. Then, Yazal turned away. Danny exhaled slowly. Not yet. Let him move first. Yazal took another step, then another, moving further away. Danny counted the beats of his own pulse. 5 seconds, 10, 15. Then he moved. Not fast, not aggressively, just enough to slip away before Yazal could adjust. He angled his steps carefully, circling around the ridge, putting distance between them. He needed to keep Yazal chasing shadows, following false leads. Time passed. The jungle became his ally. Yazal was relentless, but Danny was patient. He didn't panic, didn't push his limits. He played the long game, making himself invisible when needed, redirecting Yazal's focus. The minutes ticked down, the clock winding closer to the 60-minute mark. Then, the final moment arrived. Yazal made a last, desperate move. He changed tactics. Instead of tracking Danny directly, he began circling, trying to cut off escape routes. It was a good plan. It might have worked, but Danny had already planned for it. When Yazal closed in, Danny wasn't there. The final seconds counted down. 60 minutes. The simulation ended. Danny stood where he had last positioned himself, his breath even, his pulse steady. The jungle faded around them, dissolving back into the sterile light of the lecture hall. Yazal stood several feet away, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Professor Excitrell's voice cut through the silence. The challenge is complete. Danny Green is the victor. A murmur rippled through the class. Some looked surprised. Others looked thoughtful. Yazal's jaw tensed, but he didn't argue. He simply exhaled, his expression shifting from frustration to something closer to reluctant respect. Danny met his gaze. He didn't smirk, didn't gloat. He just nodded. Yazal studied him for another moment, then nodded back. Professor Zeitrel clasped his hands behind his back, his eyes scanning the students. What you have all witnessed today is a lesson in adaptability. Strategy is not about raw intelligence. It is not about computing the highest number of probabilities. It is about understanding the patterns of the game, knowing when to move and when to wait. He turned his gaze toward Danny. And it would seem that some among you have mastered that skill better than others. Danny didn't react. He didn't need to. The lesson had already been learned. The game was over, and he had won.